Hey everyone, welcome back. Bergson Part 7, Introduction to Metaphysics, Philosophy 1301, Philosophy 1304, future courses I'm not sure about. Um, this should be the last video. Let's get it pulled up. All right. So, at this point, we've got the two ways of knowing anything, intuition versus analysis. Lots of stuff about the relationship between unity and multiplicity, elements versus parts, another way of thinking about intuition versus analysis, another way of thinking about the whole and immanence in relation to everything else, or is everything else, as opposed to discrete entities. Um, he doesn't use transcendence versus immanence as terms, but that's really what this is about in a way. Deleuze will explain that further. Um, yes, and at this point, he's also showing us why different schools of philosophy, different scientific disciplines get into arguments, even people within the same scientific discipline. Um, and in a way, this process of like intuiting and modeling and expressing and then re-intuiting and refining and arguing is necessary. Thinking about the development of the atom in physics, there's lots of different atomic models. I used this example earlier to explain like how our knowledge is imperfect and it's always improving. Um, but yeah, they probably have like more accurate intuitions and they're able to express. All right, let's read. So we've got another, say, we'll go for another 45 minutes from here or until we're done. But at most, I know when we should stop. That there are not two different ways of knowing things thoroughly. That the various sciences have their roots in metaphysics is what the philosophers of antiquity in general believed. Not in that lay their error. Yeah, so he's going to talk about ancient versus modern philosophy for a bit, I think, if I remember correctly. It consisted in adopting the belief so natural to the human mind that a variation can only express and develop invariabilities. The result of this was that action was a weakened contemplation, duration a false, deceptive, and mobile image of immobile eternity, the soul a fall of the idea. The whole of that philosophy, which begins with Plato and ends with Plotinus, is the development of a principle that we should formulate thus. There is more in the immutable than in the moving, and one passes from the stable to the unstable by a simple diminution. We'll see this in Plato in his forms in a few weeks, if you're in my intro class. Now, the contrary is the truth. Diminution, sorry, right? The contrary is the truth because for Bergson, the mobile, the mutable is more real than what we like mistakenly believe is the thing, the static particular perspective we take. In my reading of Plato, um, the static thing is kind of in the first instance, and the form has to be something different than what Bergson criticizes. But we'll start here. I may be wrong about that. Modern science dates from the day when mobility was set up as an independent reality. It dates from the day when Galileo, rolling a ball down an inclined plane, made the firm resolution to study this movement from high to low for itself, in itself, instead of seeking its principle in the concepts of the high and the low, two immobilities by which Aristotle thought he sufficiently explained its mobility. And that is not an isolated fact in the history of science. I take the view that several of the great discoveries, of those at least which have transformed the positive sciences or created new ones, have been so many soundings or like plumbing the depths made in duration. The more living was the reality touched, the more profound had been the sounding. But the sounding made on the sea floor brings up a fluid mass which the sun very quickly dries into solid and discontinuous grains of sand. So the intuition turns into an analysis, which loses its shimmer immediately. And the intuition of duration, when exposed to the rays of the understanding, also quickly congeals into fixed, distinct, and immobile concepts. In the living mobility of things, the understanding undertakes to mark out real or virtual stations. It notes arrivals and departures. That is all that is important to the thought of man in its natural exercise. But philosophy should be an effort to go beyond the human state, which is what I was saying earlier about trying to go beyond percepts um, and into immanence itself. On the concepts with which they have blazed the trail of intuition, scholars have preferred to fix their glance um, on the concepts, right? The more they considered these residua, or leftovers, which have reached the state of symbols, the more they attributed to all science a symbolic character. And the more they believed in the symbolic character of science, the more they affected it and emphasized it until they're just playing symbol games with each other, language games. It was not long before they noticed no difference in positive science between the data of immediate intuition and the immense work of analysis that the understanding pursues around intuition. And they noticed no difference because they started playing just these, they really lost sight of the data of immediate intuition. That's the only way that's possible to conflate the two, is to get lost completely in the latter. The immense work of analysis that the understanding pursues around intuition. Thus, they prepared the way for a doctrine which affirms the relativity of all our forms of knowledge, because they were conflating the two, they got lost in the latter, etc. But metaphysics has also worked toward that. Why did the masters of modern philosophy, I think he talks about the soul and the differences between the soul and idea. One prioritizes idea versus soul. So in ancient, they prioritized the idea and the soul was a diminution. In the modern, they prioritize the soul at the expense of the idea. And I'm a little fuzzy on the remembering the details past that, but we'll get there. Why did the masters of modern philosophy, who were renovators of science in addition to being metaphysicians, not have the feeling of the mobile continuity of the real? So he's saying even though they may have addressed the issue of ancient, they still weren't hitting the mark. Why did they not place themselves in what we call concrete duration? They did so more than they thought, and much more than they said they did. If any attempt is made to connect by continuous links the intuitions around which systems are organized, one finds, along with several other convergent or divergent lines, a well-determined direction of thought and feeling. What is this latent thought? How is this feeling to be expressed? To borrow once more the language of the Platonists, this stripping the words of their psychological meaning by calling idea a certain assurance of easy intelligibility, and soul a certain preoccupation with life. Um, actually, Ed Casey seems to make a similar distinction between spirit and soul, where he says that spirit likes to jump ahead and take shortcuts, and soul is actually a vivifying force. A certain preoccupation with life, we shall say that an invisible current makes modern philosophy tend to lift the soul above the idea. In this, as in modern science, and even more so, it tends to move in the opposite direction from ancient thought. But this metaphysics, like this science, has deployed around its inner life a rich tissue of symbols, occasionally forgetting that if science needs symbols in its analytic development, I think this is kind of really close to things like non-philosophy, where people argue that philosophy misses the point or gets like it's just talking to itself, or that it depends on the forgetting of an original assumption that it can't understand. I've had that intuition before. I've had experiences in my life where I'm not doing as much philosophy and I'm just enjoying things because I'm not trying to understand them or take them apart. I'm just kind of like very thrown into the experiencing. Um, but I think Bergson gives us a way to do philosophy and still experience, still be human. And he's critical of those moments where we forget the human experiencing the point of it all, the pragmatism, the human pragmatism of philosophy, while still going beyond the human into the truth. into the nature of reality, which makes it something truly wonderful and incredible. But but this metaphysics, like the science of the moderns, has deployed around its inner life a rich tissue of symbols, occasionally forgetting that if science needs symbols in its analytical development, the principal justification for metaphysics is a break with symbols. Here again, the understanding has pursued its work of fixing, dividing, reconstructing. True, it has pursued it under a somewhat different form. Without emphasizing a point I propose to develop elsewhere, let me confine myself to saying that the understanding, whose role is to operate on stable elements, can seek stability either in relations or in things. Insofar as it works on relational concepts, it ends in scientific symbolism. Insofar as it operates on concepts of things, it ends in metaphysical symbolism. But in either case, the arrangement comes from it. It would willingly believe itself independent. Rather than recognizing at once what it owes to the deep intuition of reality, it is exposed to what is only seen in all its work, to an artificial arrangement of symbols. It's kind of like I think he's saying that it's talking to itself. Um, when he says, in either case, the arrangement comes from it. I need to figure out what he means by it here. So I think he means the understanding produces the arrangement of the relations and the different symbols. So it kind of like takes what is there and contorts its own form onto them. Rather than recognizing at once what it owes to the deep intuition of reality, it is exposed to what is only seen in all its work, to an artificial arrangement of symbols, with the results that if one keeps to the letter of what metaphysicians and scholars say, as well as to the content of what they do, one might believe that the first have dug a deep tunnel under reality, while the others have thrown over it an elegant bridge, but that the moving river of things passes between these two works of art without touching them. Okay, let's pause for a second. I need to do something. All right, welcome back, guys. Um, Sorry about that. All right, let's keep going. One of the principal tricks of Kantian criticism consisted in taking the metaphysician and the scholar at their word and pushing metaphysics and science to the utmost possible limit of symbolism, where, in any case, they lead of their own accord the moment the understanding lays claim to an independence full of dangers. Once the relation of science and metaphysics with intellectual intuition is misunderstood, Kant has no difficulty in showing that our science is entirely relative and our metaphysics wholly artificial. So the same conflation he criticized earlier. Because he strained the independence of the understanding in both cases, because he relieved metaphysics and science of the intellectual intuition which gave them their inner weight, and did understanding and asked understanding to take up too much weight and do too much, um, which gave him the inner weight. Science with its relations presents to him only an outer wrapping of form, and metaphysics with its things an outer wrapping of matter. Is it surprising then that the first shows him only frameworks within frameworks, and the second phantoms pursuing phantoms? He struck our science and metaphysics such rude blows that they have not yet entirely recovered from their shock. Our mind would willingly resign itself to see in science a wholly relative knowledge and in metaphysics an empty speculation. It seems to us even today that Kantian criticism applies to all metaphysics and to all science. In reality, applies especially to the philosophy of the ancients as well as to the form, still ancient, that the moderns have given most often to their thought. It is valid against a metaphysics which claims to give us a unique and ready-made system of things, against a science which would be a unique system of relations, finally against a science and a metaphysics which present themselves with the architectural simplicity of a Platonic theory of ideas or of a Greek temple. So anytime the understanding or metaphysics ossifies or separates itself from reality and is no longer flexible or fluid and comes from that reality, um, it is very empirical in that regard, right? But it's not an empiricism that's so scattered that it can't do anything. Um, and so he is critiquing the transcendental rationalism of a structure of independent things. Okay. Um, as well as the rationalism of like truth makes reality. Truth is reality. Reality is truth. So he's saying that Kant is justified in critiquing metaphysics if metaphysics is this distorted thing that's separated from reality. But Kant doesn't put us in the right place, basically. And we're still trying to like work through like noumena versus phenomena and all these other positions that Kant takes us to, which we need to address and process and consider. But if they're wrong, we may have gone off a branch that we need to like to decide is like, okay, yeah. Um, it's funny because Kant's like, we can't do metaphysics, and now we're like, well, we can't do metaphysics the way Kant tried to do metaphysics. That's the actual appropriate takeaway from Kant, what Kant proved. Kant didn't prove that you can't make a light bulb. He proved you can't make a light bulb that way. Edison didn't find, Edison didn't, for every time he failed, he didn't decide you can't make a light bulb. He said there's another way you can't make a light bulb. And that's what science does with its negative methodology. It says, well, we can't disprove it this way. 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 And eventually the theories are what you can disprove. It's an often missed point in the philosophy of science that science never actually proves anything, only disproves the what they call the null hypothesis. You invert what you want to prove, try to disprove it, repeatedly can't disprove it, um, or you disprove the null hypothesis, and so you disprove the alternatives. Okay. If metaphysics claims to be made up of concepts we possessed prior to it, if it consists in an ingenious arrangement of pre-existing ideas, which we utilize like the materials of construction for a building. In short, if it is something other than the constant dilation of our mind, the constant experience of reason and pleasure, the constantly renewed effort to go beyond our actual ideas and perhaps our simple logic as well, something that is truly transformational. It is too evident that it becomes artificial, like all works of pure understanding, self-contained, stagnant, can't grow, can't live and breathe, change. There's no freedom. And if science is wholly the work of analysis or of conceptual representation, if experience is only to serve as the verification of clear ideas, if instead of starting from multiple and varied intuitions inserted into the movement proper to each reality, but not always fitting into one another, it claims to be an immense mathematics, a single system of relations, which imprisons the totality of the real in a mesh prepared for it. Like I was saying, that rationalistic universal language, the the truth that determines the reality, the form, the transcendental form that deduces what must be true, must be real. It becomes a knowledge purely relative to the human understanding. So, like Spinoza, for example, um, I'm actually fond of reading Spinoza as an empiricist. He has his geometric method where he wants to prove things and ground them, but he got those through experience, through a materialist experiencing. Now, whether if you can have something like rationalist materialism or idealistic empiricism, um, because those parallels between idealism and materialism, where materialism is like scattered and empirical, I think the definitions are poorly constructed at this point. Um, and so we end up kind of dancing around with those different parallels. And the same parallel might apply differently depending on which moment we're in with our intuition, because we're using a word to capture an intuition that is more complex than just that word, and it's fleeting around, like Bergson is saying. Okay. It becomes a knowledge purely relative to the human understanding. So if all that's true, instead of starting from multiple and varied intuitions, instead of starting from multiple and varied intuitions inserted into the movement proper to each reality, but not always fitting into one another. This is a good thing too, because he tells us here that the intuitions are kind of like crystalline, um, multiple and varied intuitions that kind of pop off from the movement proper to each reality. Um, it's sort of like it's really like a explosive, amalgamating phenomenal field, a madhouse of affect. Just funny mirrors everywhere. What do they call those? No, I don't want sales stuff. Um, I think I do mean this. Distorting mirror, funhouse mirror, carnival mirror. So funhouse instead of a madhouse. Funhouse under the sky. Um, I like this one. This is a good one. This is a really good one for talking about like phenomenal phasing. Royalty-free images. Woo. Okay. Anyway, these multiple and varied intuitions are like those like distortions, these distorted, they're all slightly distorted. They're not, they're not distorted, but everything we're experiencing is distorted. And you've got to make sense of those distortions. So, because they're multiple and varied. Um, it can be overwhelming to the mind's ability to intuit or concept the complexity of the system. Excuse me. A close reading of the Critique of Pure Reason will show that for Kant, this kind of universal mathematics is science, and this barely modified Platonism metaphysics. To tell the truth, the dream of a universal mathematics is itself only a survival of Platonism. And it's kind of what I've been saying about the forms transcending down and determining everything else, the universal language being interior to everything and determining its laws and dictating how things operate, that you could codify the world and predict everything and know everything. I think this is actually like the three body problem. When three gravitational bodies come close together, you very quickly cannot determine far into the future what will happen. The system becomes too complex. And I'm not sure if it's a matter, I think I've heard before that it's a matter, not a matter of like computational power. There is something truly unmodelable and we don't have the right translation for that relation and that affect. Maybe we'll get the mathematics for it, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Sorry, I don't mean to repeat myself and stutter. Um, what I'm trying to say is that it may in fact be proven already that we cannot know that kind of thing. So there are four types of truth values: true, false, um, unknown, currently unknown, and unknowable. And that's just like in Western philosophy. I think like in Hindu philosophy and Buddhist philosophy or Vedic logic. Um, there are like seven or eight truth values. Somebody was telling me this in graduate school. They were taking a class with a professor who I won't, I guess like a name. He's at the University of Hawaii now, Dr. Chakrabarty. Um, hmm, interesting page. But yeah, uh, I just don't know. Okay. Lots of fun stuff to follow up on if you're interested in it. Um, Universal mathematics is what the world of ideas becomes when one assumes that the idea consists in a relation or a law and no longer in a thing. Kant took for a reality the stream of certain modern philosophers. Much more, he thought that all scientific knowledge was only a detached fragment, or rather a projecting stone of universal mathematics. The main task of the critique, therefore, was to lay the foundations of this mathematics. That is, to determine what the intelligence should be and what should be the object in order that an unbroken mathematics might bind them together. And it follows that if all possible experience is thus assured of admittance into the rigid and already constituted frameworks of our understanding, unless we assume a pre-established harmony, our understanding itself organizes nature and finds itself reflected in it as in a mirror. Whence the possibility of science, which owes all its effectiveness to its relativity, and the impossibility of metaphysics, since the latter will find nothing more to do than to parody on the phantoms of things, the work of conceptual arrangement, which science pursues seriously on relations. In short, the whole critique of pure reason leads to establishing the fact that Platonism, illegitimate if ideas are things, becomes legitimate if ideas are relations, and that the ready-made idea, once thus brought down from heaven to earth, is indeed, as Plato wished, the common basis of thought and nature. But the whole critique of pure reason rests also upon the postulate that our thought is incapable of anything but Platonizing, that is, of pouring the whole of possible experience into pre-existing molds, of taking our intuition and putting it into an analysis or an expression. That is the whole question. If scientific knowledge is indeed what Kant insisted it was, um, there is a simple science preformed and even preformulated in nature, as Aristotle believed. From this logic immanent in things, the great discoveries only illuminate point by point the line traced and advanced, as on a festival night a string of bulbs flick on one by one, to give the outline of a monument. And if metaphysical knowledge is indeed what Kant intended, it is reduced to the equal possibility of two opposed attitudes of mind toward all the great problems. Its manifestations are so many arbitrary choices, always ephemeral, between two solutions virtually formulated from all eternity. It lives and dies from antinomies, but the truth is that neither does the science of modern times present this unilinear simplicity, nor the metaphysics of the moderns these irreducible oppositions. Modern science is neither one nor simple. It rests, I readily agree, upon ideas one ultimately finds clear, but these ideas, when they are profound, become progressively clear by the use made of them. They owe then the best part of their luminosity to the light cast back upon them through reflection, by the facts and applications to which they have led, the clarity of a concept being little else, accordingly, than the assurance, once it is acquired, of manipulating it to advantage. At the start, more than one of them must have appeared obscure, difficult to reconcile with the ideas already accepted by science, and bordering on the absurd. That is to say that science does not proceed by the regular nesting of concepts predestined to fit neatly inside one another. Profound and fruitful ideas are so many points of contact with currents of reality which do not necessarily converge on the same point. It is true that the concepts in which they lodge always manage somehow or other, and rounding off their corners by reciprocal friction, to make shift among themselves. On the other hand, the metaphysics of the moderns is not made of solutions so radical that they can lead to irreducible oppositions. This would no doubt be so if there were no means of accepting at the same time and in the same field the thesis and antithesis of the antinomies. But to philosophize consists precisely in placing oneself by an effort of intuition inside this concrete reality on which from the outside of the critique, from which from the outside the critique takes the two opposing views, thesis and antithesis. I shall never imagine. Okay, so now we're getting out here quickly. We're on the last two pages of this essay, and this is the part that I did not cut. I had my students jump back in here if they were going to not cut. So, yeah, I'll have to maybe find this timestamp if I want students to do that to let them know they can jump ahead at this point. Um, I again don't recommend it, but I think this is like where it gets accessible again without a background in the history of philosophy. I think that those few pages, basically all of nine up until where we are now, really depended on thinking about ancient philosophy, modern philosophy, Kantianism, what Kant did, what they had different. To make sense of it, I really had to like bring to the fore kind of some understandings about what I already know. And so I don't think it's very accessible. But I do think we get back into images and metaphors and plain language intuitionism, which I love Bergson for on these last two pages. So here we go. Let's take it home, guys. We can do it. I shall never imagine how black and white intermingle if I have not seen gray. But I have no difficulty in understanding once I have seen gray, how one can envisage it from the double viewpoints of black and white, which is why the two opposite positions of the antinomies are resolved by intuition, by the proper intuition, but by the intuitionistic method, the method of intuitionism. Doctrines which have a basis of intuition escape Kantian criticism to the exact extent that they are intuitive. And these doctrines are the whole of metaphysics, provided one does not take the metaphysics congealed and dead in theses, but living in philosophers. To be sure, these divergences are striking between the schools, that is to say, in short, between the groups of disciples formed around certain of the great masters. But would one find them as clear-cut between the masters themselves? Something here dominates the diversity of systems, something, I repeat, simple and definite, like a sounding of which one feels that it has more or less reached the bottom of the same ocean, even though it brings each time to the surface very different materials. It is on these materials that disciples normally work. And that is the role of analysis. And the master, insofar as he formulates, develops, translates into abstract ideas what he brings, is already, as it were, his own disciple. But the simple act which has set analysis in motion, and which hides behind analysis, emanates from a faculty quite different from that of analyzing. This is by very definition, intuition. Let it be said in conclusion that there is nothing mysterious about this faculty. Whoever has worked successfully at literary composition well knows that when the subject has been studied at great length, all the documents gathered together, all notes taken, something more is necessary to get down to the work of composition itself. An effort, often painful, immediately to place oneself in the very heart of the subject and to seek as deeply as possible an impulsion which, as soon as found, carries one forward of itself. This impulsion, once received, sets the mind off on a road where it finds both the information it gathered and other details as well. It develops, analyzes itself in terms whose enumeration follows on without limit. The farther one goes, the more is disclosed about it. Never will one manage to say everything, and yet, if one turns around suddenly to seize the impulsion felt, it slips away, for it was not a thing but an urge to movement, and although indefinitely extensible, it is simplicity itself. So when I'm extemporizing all my interpretations or my thoughts to you, they kind of come from an instant. Um, and when I try to explain that or grasp it or analyze it or understand what it is, I can't. It's gone. It's only because it's this impulse to move. Metaphysical intuition seems to be something of the same kind. What in this case matches the notes and documents of the literary composition is the collection of observations and experiences gathered by positive science and above all by a reflection of the mind on the mind. A reflection of the mind on the mind of the mind on the mind is basically why Sartre says that phenomenology is better suited than psychology to come to a self-comprehensive understanding of the totality of the world, or the synthesis of human and world, or the nature of consciousness, or the relation, or the solution to the hard problem of consciousness. Um, he says that Husserl was willing to take advantage of the of consciousness's absolute proximity to itself, of being's absolute proximity to itself. So a reflection of the mind on the mind, perhaps with a phenomenological method or with the intuitionistic method, which should be the same thing because the phenomenology uses eidetic intuition. For one does not obtain from reality an intuition, that is to say, a spiritual harmony with its innermost quality, if one has not gained its confidence by a long comradeship with its superficial manifestation. These are the notes and documents, the collection of observations and experiences, a reflection of the mind on the mind. All of these things are the not piecemeal, but partial phenomena that are funhouse distortions that have to be intuited through to see the different patterns. Um, and it is not a question simply of assimilating the outstanding facts. It is necessary to accumulate and fuse such an enormous mass of them that one may be assured in this fusion of neutralizing by one another all the preconceived and premature ideas observers may have deposited unknowingly in their observations. This is why philosophy also often consists in knowing that you don't know things. Um, it's a deconstructive or a destructive, mostly deconstructive process, an early Socratic process of crafting hesitancy into consciousness. And with consciousness here, I mean first person consciousness, crafting hesitancy into perception. Let's say perception. Although perception is also desubjectivated because the receptivity of the world is a form of perception. They have the same vacuous open-endedness. Only thus does the raw material of the known facts emerge. Even in the simple and privileged case which served us as an example, even for the direct contact of the self with the self, the definitive effort, is a weird way to say definitive, the definitive effort of distinct intuition would be impossible for anyone who had gathered and collected a very great number of psychological analyses. The masters of modern philosophy have been men who had assimilated all the material, let's say humans, have been humans who had assimilated all the material of the science of their time. And the partial eclipse of metaphysics since the last half century has been caused more than anything else by the extraordinary difficulty the philosopher experiences today in making contact with a science already much too scattered. But metaphysical intuition, although one can achieve it only by means of material knowledge. Okay, hold on. So this has gotten more difficult for the philosopher because of the scattered nature of science. This is why ultimately um, you still need philosophers, but scientists need to be metaphysicians because if you had thousands of scientists with metaphysical facility, really have thousands of philosophers at that point, but they're not focusing on the philosophical discipline or the philosophical discourse interior to itself per se, but they're using this intuitionistic method to philosophize through science. Then you could get great discoveries like he was talking about before. So I don't think it's possible for one person to accumulate. It's not possible for AI to assimilate all of this. AI wouldn't be able to have the intuitionistic method is really the problem there. Um, But if you had thousands or teams of thousands of collaborative scientists constantly plumbing intuition, that is feasible. That's what should be happening. But metaphysical intuition, although one can achieve it only by means of material knowledge, is an entirely different thing from the summary or synthesis of this knowledge. It is as distinct from it as the motor impulsion is distinct from the path traced by the moving object, as the tension of the spring is distinct from the visible movements in the clock. In this sense, Metaphysics has nothing in common with a generalization of experience, and yet it could be defined as the whole of experience. De experience integral. In this sense, metaphysics has nothing in common with a generalization of experience, and yet it could be defined as the whole of experience. All right. Um, that's Bergson's Introduction to Metaphysics. Um, at this point, you may have some questions, and if you are in my classes and there's an exam, it's really on you at this point to dig into the material. Bergson repeatedly states that you can't access this. I can't do it all for you. Um, just chew on it. So I hope you enjoy it. Read it a few more times. I've read this over a dozen times by now. Um, Still more to learn every time, but it's one of my favorites. I think it's foundational to doing philosophy. Even if you don't know everything he's talking about, it at least puts you in the right direction. And I think it's accessible because he talks to a lot about personal experiences like the intuition of your own life. It's kind of like the cogito ergo sum, but the intuition of concrete duration is something that you can access personally in your own mind, um, without labels, without words, without reference points. It's kind of the ground of existence and being. Yeah, we can say it's the ground of being. Um, and so for some phenomenologists, that's perception itself. This open-ended, ongoing experiencing. This is my first time finishing a reading in a video, so I'm not sure if there's other things I want to be doing, but at this point in my curriculum and my career, I don't think of a lot of other things. I try to summarize it so much as we go that I don't feel the need to like rehash anything. So take a look at the guiding questions. Um, if you're in my Phil 1301 class, we would have done this in weeks 2 and 3 and take the exam at the end of week 3. So it's about a 2-week chunk to do this Bergson. And there's the exam prompt. Maybe some of it makes more sense to you now. Maybe pause the video, take a look at it, see which of this you can answer now and which of this you still can't answer. And be prepared to answer every single one of these pieces in 45 minutes. If you get details wrong, it's a C. If you get multiple details wrong, it's a D. If you didn't try, I mean, I don't want to have to give zeros for what I consider just you knew the expectations, and I was very, very clear with you. Um, and you didn't put in the time. So yeah, do that. I think the videos in total are about 5 hours now for this Bergson section. That's more than we would have covered in class for 3 hours a week for 2 weeks, especially because we're going to have 45 minutes exam in this week as well. So it's basically like almost 6 hours, um, which is pretty much 3 weeks. But really, if you do them like because of transition periods, you only get uh, in a 3 credit course, you're actually only meeting if it's 50 minutes 3 times a week, then you lose half an hour. And if it's an hour and 75 minutes, an hour and 15 minutes twice a week, you also still lose half an hour. Um, so 5 hours is actually on pace for 2 weeks of meeting time, but it's not on pace for 1.5 weeks of meeting time with an exam. And I'm not pushing the exam. Um, some of my models, like an asynchronous model, you might consider this to be as long as the class time is supposed to go. I don't. I consider this to be supplemental class material to access the readings that you should do on your own. This is not necessarily a lecture. And in class time is discussing it more, talking about your lives, talking about your experiences, really developing that facility with the ideas so that you can come in and test in 45 minutes. So make sure you have that on your own in the self-paced setting. Um, This prompt goes on the next page. It ends down there. I am nervous about the first exam. I'm always nervous about the first exam. My past semesters, my students have done well, and I was very proud of them. I'm very impressed. But uh, I don't think I think that you need to take it as seriously as you can. Um, I think that they did well because they took it as seriously as they can, and if they weren't concerned about doing well and weren't a little anxious about doing well and weren't agitated to motivated and stimulated to hold themselves accountable to do their best with some earnest, real talk, um, I want you to pass. I want you to make an A. It's totally doable. Totally doable. You need to study the material. You need to know what you're talking about. Talk to it with a friend. I think other students realize they get in, they try to write about it, they don't know it as well as they realize. You can get ahead of that by talking to your friends about the material. When you try to explain it to like a family member, a parent, sibling, roommate, um, you will find what you're still confused about. Or they'll ask you questions like, that doesn't make sense to me. That's not clear to me. Um, and you'll realize, oh, my presentation was missing this. I may understand this, but I'm not sure how to say it yet. I didn't think to say it. I'm not being as thorough as I thought I was. Um, you need to play test all those things outside of the exam setting with these questions and your friends. Okay. Thank you for being here. I care about you. I think that this will help you live a wonderful life. I think it makes things beautiful, makes things easy, simple, fun. You don't need to get lost in the sauce of all the details. You just got the intuition and you run it. Um, Pets are not in here. They are sleeping, so I will not disturb them. But thanks for sticking with the Bergson. This is the end of part seven. It's the end of the series on this reading. Um, Leave questions in the comments, and uh, thanks for being here. Take care of yourself and be kind. Bye. And have a good week or a good weekend or whatever it is. And good luck on the exam.